fantastic talks. So, does anyone have any questions to start us off?
I have a question and it's a genuine question. I'm not asking it for the sake of gender balance. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this idea of the neutral in relation to perhaps Lacan's object petite a, and perhaps also multitude object petite a, because it's a thing that doesn't sit within conventions, although it's placed with this binary, and multitude because of multitude. And I know it doesn't get to a conclusion of how we might get across this, or go past this postmodernist crisis. I'm wondering if you are getting to it in your thesis.
That's a question I really
Yeah, I mean, I think for the benefit of everyone, you should probably explain what the object petite is.
Well, object petite basically, in the plainest term, is the thing that subverts love. And I'm thinking of the way you describe how the neutral is the thing that doesn't sit within the binary comfortably.
Uh-huh.
I don't know, perhaps this is like the conversation we can have elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, interested!
I think, I find it definitely, I can definitely see the connection with multitude. I think I need more time to think about how Lacan fits into this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that like the historical moment in which Hart and Negri are theorizing multitude, like to give people context, this is they're an American and an Italian philosopher who, I guess, the question that they're interested in is how do we reconcile different versions of identity politics in order to achieve social change? Is there like a, because I mean the question that the issue that they're responding to is, well, you have, say, a lot of Marxist thinkers who think that class is the one true determinant of that can lead to a really universal revolution, and then you have a bunch of people making the very good point that, well, there's a lot of variance other than class that are really important. A multitude is their way of trying to account for these variants whilst still within a roughly Marxist framework. As to how it relates to the neutral, I mean, I think what they have in common is a kind of, well, a resistance to binary thinking for sure, but also a kind of an interest in synthesizing theory from very different backgrounds. Yeah.
Should we come back to this one first?
Yeah, I'm really sorry to put you on the spot, but it was great. I learned very much.
Okay. Adrian, it looks like you have something.
No, just on the object petite a. I think maybe just a historical example to kind of describe better. So there was this linguistic anthropologist named Miyako Inoue who wrote on the emergence of modern Japan, and in I want to say the 1890s, there were Japanese male intellectuals who worked for state universities and imperial universities, and they were linguists also. And so one of the things they did was, I want to ask them why, but you can't because they're dead. They lurked elementary schools, right, or high schools, but they lurked, they eavesdropped on young women at that moment of modernity after the major restoration of Taisho democracy, and they described schoolgirl language as an aberration to kind of traditional women's language that they imagined, which obviously didn't exist. And that schoolgirl language would become the women's language that has continued to be taught today as the idealized language for women in Japan. And this scholar says that the objet petit a, the thing that subverts, is the fact that it's not that the men intellectuals make an objective claim to the schoolgirls, it's that the men intellectuals are experiencing anxieties of modernity, are experiencing anxieties of rupture, of disjointedness in their encounter with different speech. And it's that experience, that challenge to their conception of modernity, masculinity, masculine speech, normative women's speech, that is kind of the object of the
This is not just, this is not a question, but I just want to bring
Geek
this
out,
to a
yeah.
close. But I wonder how we might get past it instead of dwelling on this constant sense of crisis of being threatened of this postmodern crisis, and Philip kind of beautifully draws to a close in a way that leaves everything open. I'm just wondering if you are getting somewhere else with your thesis. But we can keep talking about it.
Any other questions? Irina?
This was great. Thank you, guys. I think what we have here are basically demonstrations of 3 different ways to think with threes. Adam's presentation had 3 states of matter. Sorry, I'm like really grasping this thing. But anyway, you had water or solids, liquids, and gases. God, I said water. And these 3 states are presented as a continuum, and you even had this little thing down below that entropy increases as we move towards gas and information decreases. So there's this continuum, so to speak. Then we have the 3 actors on the world scene, which kind of develop side by side, and they influence each other, but you kind of have been leading us down these 3 roads, or tracing these 3 different continuums, I suppose, that influence each other. And what Philip was talking about, a fantasy essentially of an entirely other term, something that is not part of a continuum. And it wasn't even about the continuum at all, because the binary is not a continuum, very much so. It is precisely that those 2 chambers with the demons standing in the middle, not letting any particle through, ever. Maybe the demon is the neutral.
So exercising the demon might be the neutral, maybe.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to ask you guys to reflect on these disciplinary differences between the ways we think about the interrelationship of 3 terms.
Do you want to go through it in sequence? Adrian, I'll start with something.
And just to connect that with, I mean, one of the things that, so even I struggle like where to, like there's food studies, but also just in terms of area studies, like where I identify myself, right? Like there's Philippine history, there's the American, there's the Japanese, 3 of which I study commonly. But I'm just thinking about the term, like to kind of springboard from the neutral, the neuter. What about the word trans? The term trans, as in, for example, area studies scholars have been starting to try to use trans as a response to kind of modernization, Cold War era conceptualisms of inter, as in instead of like inter-empire, inter-nations, internationalism, interrelationships, right, we think trans-empire, right? Because I mean, if we look at kind of the 3rd space of, I mean, the Philippines, right, or in the Pacific Islands, in historiographies, they were written as either collaborators or resistors, but no one ever talks about the 3rd space, as in like, what did empire mean to, let's say, someone living in Hagat ng Guam, who was of the lower class, who was both colonized by the Americans and the Japanese? There are both empires, and oral histories have argued that, especially elderly folks from the Pacific Islands have started to blur the Japanese, even the German, the British, the American empires as an empire, as in like some of them treated us better than others, but now that we're free, we don't really feel free, right? And so it's also indicative of the transient nature of empires, the transient nature of like trying to construct these interbinaries, right? Of like an empire competing with an empire. Well, what happens to the people they're competing over, right? Kind of offers the same question.
Adam, you look like you're deep in thought. What do you have in mind?
I think the questions about binary thinking physics so that's the question I'll ask.
Yeah, the question was a bit wordy and clearly posed by someone in the humanities. I guess, well, for example, I'm interested in this trend for using the word or the prefix trans as opposed to inter. Like, can we trace, find some connections between the metaphors that we use, spatial metaphors, that we use in the humanities and in the social sciences, to the history of science, of, you know, science. If we imagine the world consisting of objects, we would arguably be more likely to talk about concepts as objects. If we focus on, I don't know, energy moving and becoming different things and changing states but kind of remaining the same, our metaphors for society and culture would be different. I'm sorry for holding it with the space.
Curious question, because I mean, at least I think for people in the sciences, we sort of tend to think of the world as sort of having a universe-sized disregard for our opinion of it. This endless, cold, uncaring thing that doesn't care how we interpret it. It is what it is. I mean, that's kind of a conceit of science, and we mostly deal with, as you say, metaphors, things that are human conceivable.
There are certainly imprints of kind of the age in which a science was developed, and at least the language used to describe it. If you read the work of the early thermodynamicists, they're all like obsessed with steam engines. And so they're like, and so I'll be like, Lord, the Clausius statement of the second law of thermodynamics is that heat can't go from cold to hot, basically, but then the Kelvin statement is that if you build an engine, it can't run forever, basically. And then there's all this stuff about engines that goes on for, and this language is still employed today to some extent.
Human nutrition is
But-
actually.
But how do you, based on what you just said, like how do you actually come to terms with the universe or the world being generally unapologetic, unconcerned with how we feel about it, and the concept that information is in fact physical? If we produce information, then therefore we are affecting the environment, and it is not entirely, it does not exist entirely independent of our interpretation of it, if in fact the information we produce is somehow physical.
So the like syntactic content of the information is physical. Like it's irrespective of what exactly you're thinking. It's how much space you need to store that thought. That
Sure.
there's no, but like the sentence "I'm happy and I'm sad" would be indistinguishable according from this layer of perspective. So the semantics are not explained. At least, I mean, perhaps they are ultimately physical in some sense, but not in the sense I've described.
Right, and you're saying that at some point, I mean, I think all of you said at some point you require some type of clearing, whether that's like neutral or forgetting about colonial history, or the sense of like clearing existing coding within mechanical structure in order to release space, or release heat, create space, release information in order to allow for information to be recreated or allow the laws to repeat themselves, right? So like, it's not that it's unaffected by the information that we're creating if it does in fact exist somewhat in physical space. It is like semantic, the way that we're storing it, but the fact that we have to store something that doesn't actually exist means that what doesn't actually exist truly does exist and is affecting our environment and requires clearing. And so if we're like all sitting on a ton of information, to what extent are we just like responsible to clear it and allow it to repeat itself to like achieve that like neutrality, that third state? I don't know.
I think Adrian has something to jump in with us.
That's a good point. That's great. I mean, I think it's the difference between like erasing and erasure, like in a postmodern sense, or like effacement of like, you know, you like, let's say with history or memory, you inscribe something really hard on a piece of paper and then you erase it, and the best you can do is erase it, but like the marks are still there, right? But like, to show the you know, that the entropy is not absolutely infinite in that kind of conception, that like you can reverse, but like it takes really hard labor. I mean, like to think of like the politics of memory, you're forgetting empire, right? That part of what makes national and colonial narratives successful is the fact that they erase and foreclose certain side narratives, right? And part of the labor of, you know, oral historians, of historians of empire, of, you know, ethnographers doing these kinds of interviews is to try to recover those. And part of the reason why it's so hard is that we get caught up in how do we interpret this thing, right? How do you work, you know, working in history, how do you work to recover colonial stories of colonial resistance when my very discipline of history itself was founded on legitimizing nation and empire, right? You have to use different techniques, which is why we have to work not even interdisciplinary, like there's that word transdisciplinary too, right, of like trying to recover alternative epistemologies. But, yeah.
Philip, did you have something to?
I mean, there's a lot, like, a lot has been said.
To Irina's, what Irina kicked off.
I mean, yeah, one thing that has struck me, I guess the most direct connection is probably to what you were saying, Trevor, about the feeling in the sciences. I can't remember your eloquent phrase for it.
A universe-sized indifference.
Exactly. Whereas, I mean, both Adrian and I coincidentally framed our talks as stories,
Yeah.
which I guess comes from a feeling on both of our parts that stories are important, and that the way that we tell them is important. And I'm just thinking about, I mean, I guess now I'm telling a story about storytelling, but the form in which we delivered those talks definitely like says something interesting about what we believe is possible to change and worth changing.
Further questions? Okay, I see a couple back there. Chizoba and then Ed.
Oh, I do.
Oh.
I had a question for Adrian. Because of Filipinos interested in following the history, the Spanish, how does that, you briefly mentioned the class structure, and how with the introduction of meat served was for more of the upper class and the lower class, but then how did that influence with the coming of the Japanese as well, and the American influence? How does that affect the creation of cultures and also class within all those periods of time?
Right. So I think I'm going to tie that point with that point. The labor of Spanish colonial history that, you know, I whenever I talk about the history of the Philippines to undergraduate students, I always make the point that the Philippines for most of its history was governed through Mexico, not Spain directly. And then Spain directly, with a lot of labor, they tried to do a lot of make kind of legal, spatial, political means to try to govern. But the Spanish and the Mexican elite who governed the Philippines only ever took up only ever really influenced directly 1 to 3% of the population of the islands, or the space of the islands, most of which was in the picture that I showed you, Manila, that little star. And also at the same time, trans-Pacific trade only ever happened twice a year, from Manila to China to Philippines, right? And they would only go to both that city and Iloilo down in the center of the Philippines. And so guess where lechon is most readily available, or guess where meat was most readily available from the Spanish imperial period, those two cities. But I mean, previous histories, I guess written in the 80s about, you know, how lechon came to be universalized, right, and available to the masses, misses one important point, is that most of the country exists in diaspora, right? That it exists abroad, and the fact that it exists abroad is that now foods that were once inaccessible to the lower classes are made accessible through pretty much what the diaspora brings. Pork and suckling pig is inevitably being much cheaper in Toronto than it is in the slums of Manila, right? And so like the creation, I think, of a diasporic cuisine, of what we call Chinese cuisine, Philippine cuisine, also reflects, but also erases the idea of classes, that we think of these foods as race and ethnicity based, but actually these are the foods of the upper class that we serve publicly. But in our homes, we serve the foods of working in the middle class. For example, there's a stew made out of a tamarind-based broth that is ubiquitous in every single island of the Philippines, because it's available in every single island, but is never served in restaurants because it's not a public dish. Right? So, yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Chizoba.
My question is around what is outside the trio, because I feel like, outside, because the whole question of binaries, which I think Philip provides an entry point into, reminded me a lot of the colonial history, where in fact it was important to create hierarchies it's important to create those binaries. So it's me versus them. And based on this logic, I will divide you all in this colony and assign you all different roles. So now the alternative, I guess I was a bit uncomfortable with this alternative being some neutral position that is not very clear on the need to be anti-colonial. And anti-colonial, in my mind, goes back to something multi-centric that really provides space for different voices, different knowledge systems, that informs culture, that informs politics, that informs economics, that informs gender, and all of those things. So I guess the question to you is, to what extent do you account for the cultural and historical context in this creation of the binary? And I guess to you, Adrian, I want to hear more about the people outside of these three players, like where is the resistance of the everyday people, which I think they would have had their own conception of what food looked like and what they were doing.
Yeah, I mean, so if we, like, if you remember the like history that I traced going back to Saussure and into what became known as structuralism, I guess I followed one thread of that, which is in Barthes, a much less directly political thread. Another thread like became interested in the fact that whenever you get these binaries, as you mentioned, a hierarchy comes and one term gets privileged over the other. And this like strand of post-structuralism informs a lot of post-colonial thought and anti-colonial thought. The concept of the neutral, I see how like it can be potentially depoliticizing. That if it wants to say, if it's because it's interested in precisely resisting these binaries, it can appear to efface them. Where I think it can be, and I don't think Barthes is particularly interested in that project in particular, in the political implications of it. But I do think there are ways of thinking of using the neutral in a politically engaged way, and I think Maggie Nelson does that. I think the fact that that because it's a project for her about resisting binary thinking per se, not so much about within the terms of the binary addressing inequalities. It's about resisting the kinds of binaries that leave some people entirely outside or like uncomfortable within those binaries. So yeah, I don't think the neutral in and of itself has an obvious political and socio-historical valence, but I do think there are ways of employing that in much more engaged ways.
So if you're neither with us nor against us, you're with us?
You could put it like that.
So, Mark.
So I want to synthesize it with that comment in that the epistemology of colonialism in the 20th century is colonial, anti-colonial, or post-colonial, right? And recently there's been a turn towards the decolonizing as process, as continued process. So I'll give two examples from the Philippines, which I wish I could have gone into today. Like I highlighted Central Luzon, and there's a story there that was written about in the 1970s that I didn't quite get into, is this liberation front called the Hukbalahap, the Huks, right, in short. And they conceptualized all imperial power as something against which you must resist. As in, they took, since the 1930s, even before the Japanese occupied, like by the Americans, they organized to take hold of the rice granary of the Philippines, that region, of the rice fields, the rice paddies, to take ownership and autonomy over their own food supply and food security. And they fought off the American regime, they fought through the Japanese regime, and they fought through even the independent Philippine Republic, right? And part of the other side of that is, during the war, metropolitan Filipinos in Manila economically went down, but also were also hungered more, but also were afraid to go back to the provinces from where their ancestors or where they came because of that rebellion. And the other thing is too that during the war, actually, the rural areas, especially that area prospered more under the war. The second point, I mean, from the Philippine examples in the south among the Muslims, that the untold story of the Muslims in Bangsamoro, which is in Mindanao in the south, is that they've been resisting colonial rule ever since the Spanish landed in the Philippines up until today. As in, like, it is only and there's a scholar named Vince Raphael out of Washington who, his argument is, it is only a fiction that you can draw a map around that island as part of the Philippines, as Islas Filipinas, the Philippine Islands under the United States, because they've always been resisting, because the fact that the language has switched from Muslim Confederacy, which is centered not in Manila but in Borneo and Brunei, where the centers of powers are. The fact that the language and the history writing that we've done has switched to call them insurgents, terrorists, ladrones, criminals, counter whatever it is, right? Effaces the fact that this has been a long continuing history that they're still undergoing today, and it's still considered. I mean, if you go on like travel agencies, whenever I travel to the Philippines, there's always in red print, don't go to the south unless you have military accompaniment, right? Which is kind of the afterlife of what's been going on there with those historical narratives. So,
Any further questions?
Am I allowed to ask another?
Only if no one else wants to ask.
I have a question though. No, you go ahead.
No, I'm saying
No, you
you
go
can
ahead.
have my opportunity.
Oh,
I'm
okay,
happy.
great. Thank you. I have a question for Adrian. I'm hearing you talking about these stories of food in very masculinist terms, but usually we associate food with women, mother, home, the domestic. And I'm wondering where is the place of women in your story?
So-
What do women do with the span, for instance?
right.
That's
So
the
I
subject for TR.
Absolutely. I mean, I took up masculinist terms on purpose because I'm talking about militarism, right? And part of the further work that I'm trying to draw as I go for, like, this will become kind of the roots of 1 or 2 chapters, is the longer cultural history of nutrition behind that, right? Like where meat becomes masculine, but where the hands to prepare the meat become feminine. I mean, one of the first things that the United States did when they occupied the Philippines in order to try to domesticate, I pause on that word, the space, is instill public education, specifically home economics programs, at the same time that they were doing it back in the homeland United States. In the United States, what was happening was home economics was providing women the opportunity to go to college, to be free of being stuck at home, but the disappointment there was that they had to return home, that under professionalist terms of going to home economics programs, they had to be redomesticated. In the Philippines, that was happening under a modified structure, as in the people preparing, the hands that were preparing this food, for the most part, especially in the middle and upper classes, were educated under home economics programs, but were returned home not necessarily to their places of origin, but as servants to Americans, right? In the sense that at the very same time that in the United States that domestic servitude was being effaced, was being falling out of fashion, out of connotations of slavery, right? It was being replicated abroad in the Philippines, kind of the new aristocracy that the colonial powers were trying to have the room essentially to do, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I really like your stories of food.
Food is good. Food is good.
Any further questions? All right, well, in that case, let's thank our speakers.